Good afternoon. Welcome to the Paris Peace Forum and to this panel on G20. As you know, the title of this panel is G20, Still an Effective Forum in a Polarized World. We couldn't have a more topical discussion today. As you know, next week there will be the G20 summit with head of states from G20 countries heading to Indonesia, to Bali. And we have a great panel here today to discuss this topic with representatives of all the countries that will hold the G20 presidency in the future and the one that just hold the G20 presidency. So I will just start presenting very quickly our speakers today. The first one is Dino Patijalal, who is founder and president of the Foreign Policy Community of Indonesia. He has been a diplomat for a long time, so it will be very interesting to hear him also on. Thank you. Feel free to clap each of our speakers. Then we'll have Professor Sachin Chaturvedi, who is the Director General of the Research and Information System for Developing Countries, which is a research center, so he's an economist as well. Thank you for being here with us. Thank you. We then have Chiara Corazza, who is a private sector representative for France within the G20 Empower platform, which is a private sector representative platform within the G20. Thank you, Chiara, for being with us. And then we have Laura Carvalho, so we have another economist, and she's the Director General for Equity at the Open Society Foundations. So as you all know, the topic of this year edition of the Paris Peace Forum is the concept of multi-crises. And the question is how to address those multi-crises. And more specifically here, the question is whether the G20 can be the right forum to address this multi-crisis. We have a lot to speak about. As you know, the polarized world that the title is referring to also makes reference to the geopolitical tension that we are experiencing, to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So we'll definitely look into whether the G20 can be a useful platform for creating a dialogue, since, as you know, of course, Russia is part of the G20, even if President Putin won't attend the summit. So that's a topic we will be looking into. But then another key topic will be the question of the effectiveness. As we know, we have political statements at the end of these events, but we will see how these things can then turn into policy. So without going further into the introduction, I will just start with a very quick question for each of us, and I will ask you to please answer in 1 minute, a very short answer, on what are your main expectations to next week summit in Bali. So I would maybe start with you, Dino, if that's okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Giorgio. First thing is that the G20 summit in Bali is going to be different than any previous G20 summits because since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, G20 has never been the same and will never be the same again. The spirit of cooperation is damaged. You know, the ability to develop a consensus is also badly damaged. You know, in 2008, when we had a global financial crisis, which prompted the G20 summit process, at least all the leaders said, hey, let's work together. And they were able to coordinate their policies that led to the recovery of the world economy. But that's gone in Bali, right? I mean, in all the working group meetings that they've had on finance, industry, tourism, and so on, none of them were able to reach a communique, right? So there is very little likelihood in Bali that the G20 leaders will be able to reach a joint communique. I hope I'm wrong, but right now that's what it seems likely to happen, yeah. But it's just not the same G20 anymore.
Totally. So when it comes for your expectations for next week, they're very low, if I understand correctly.
Yeah, we have to manage expectations, and obviously there's not much that you can do given the division is so deep and so wide. And even though G20 is an economic forum, but politics and geopolitics dominate this time. Right, and it's unavoidable. Yeah.
Totally. Thank you very much. And maybe I would ask the same question to you, Sachin. So what is your main expectation for next week's summit, especially when it comes to your field of expertise?
Thank you. Thanks, Giorgio. I think we should not forget that G20 is a platform. It's a platform for interaction among leaders. So you don't expect too many actions coming out of G20 forum per se. It is largely in terms of how you look at real sort of leaders of the world are interacting, exchanging ideas, revisiting the global institutional frameworks, and the leaderships like President Macron himself, pushing in for multilateralism. So nudging WTO and the IFI reforms and things like that, the debt crisis. So these are some of the challenges, the issues that leaders can deliberate upon. So I think our expectation from the G Summit should be in terms of how it comes out with some of the major sort of deliberations that are needed, and not exactly in terms of what declaration, what institutional announcement. G20 is not meant for that.
Totally. I think we're already getting closer to the main question of our panel, which is whether G20 can deliver and what it can deliver. So if we move on with you, Chiara, what are your expectations for next week?
I really think that, and I completely agree what has been said, but my position is that more than ever, platforms as a G20 are absolutely paramount. And when I say paramount, not because we will have a wonderful communique or why we will implement many things, but it's really the place where you can put on the agenda crucial issues and really make them advance, at least sensibilizing people and knowing that there is an issue. Then this for me is very important. My personal expectation, because I worked a lot during the year in Empower, who is the task force on business champions that bring best practices on gender equality and then bring ideas in some very concrete topics of economic. It's not, it's not a strategic policy. It's very, very dedicated to the economic. I really hope that the wonderful job that has been done last year during the Italian presidency will be taken into account, that we don't go back. Because if we keep gender equality as a priority on the agenda, and we did a communique, it's maybe the only working group that did a communique, that will be an achievement for me.
Totally, that's another topic we will discuss later. So how in each G20 we don't start from scratches, but we build on what has been done by previous presidencies. Now it's up to you, Laura. What are your expectations for next week?
Sure, I would. Is this working? Okay, I would probably endorse the idea that it's not about a communique or an action plan, but the G20 can play a role. We are in the middle of a very deep economic crisis. Countries are in that distress. I think one of the issues and main issues that the leaders who are in the G20, which represents more than almost 80% of world GDP, can deliver, is on the need to rethink the common framework, which is clearly not working, that can also agree on a new round of the DSSI, the debt suspension mechanism needs to come back in a more targeted way. I think the fact that we have an Indonesian presidency, and as you mentioned at the beginning of the panel, the Troika, the predecessor, successor, are also from the global south, and I think this sets the stage for a few years of a G20 presidency, Indonesia, India, Brazil, then South Africa, that can play a role in terms of bringing together a developing country, developed country, and setting one of those, and setting these agendas and putting forward these agendas on global inequalities and the need to rethink climate financing as well.
Thank you very much. Thank you also for keeping your answers short. I think that we already have on the table a lot of topics. And maybe the first one, the one that you mentioned, is the geopolitical context in which this G20 summit is happening. So I would start with that, with a question for you, Dino. And as you know, President Putin won't attend the G20 summit. His foreign minister, Lavrov, will be there. But we hear from different capitals that there won't be bilateral meeting between Lavrov and heads of states or other ministers. So there will be some kind of isolation of Russia at this G20 summit. But then at the same time, they also tell us that they're working to put in the communique some language about de-escalation. So the G20, which is an economic forum, is switching a little bit into becoming some kind of diplomatic forum to negotiate not the peace itself, but the conditions for peace. Are you optimistic about this attempt? You already answered a little bit, but we would like to hear more on that. Thanks.
Well, so far, all the attempts to formulate a communique crash on one sentence only. That is the G7 and the Western countries outside the G7 wants to put language on Russia invading Ukraine. And then the Russian delegation always says, no, there's no such thing, right? Which is really unrealistic, right? I mean, there is a war, and that war is affecting the world economy. So unless they can find a language somewhere in the middle that both Russia and G7 can agree, then I think the possibility of having a communique is quite slim. But again, we have time, so we'll see if Indonesia can do some magic. I hope Indonesia can do some magic. But the other thing is that there are other things that can be expected from the G20 summit. The bilaterals are going to be very important. The U.S.-China Biden-Xi Jinping bilateral is going to be extremely important, and bilateral among the other major powers that will take place. That's going to actually very important to watch, yeah. And I think there's going to be an effort to push the needle in the right direction. Maybe on the Black Sea Grain Initiative, there may be some announcement, and so on about extension. So some aspects of the war that can be discussed bilaterally that would help ease the pain of the war in Ukraine. Yeah.
Totally. I mean, maybe before we move to the more economic files that will be discussed at the G20, I don't know if any of you would like maybe to react on this power that the G20 could have to bring peace, or on this difficulty of having Russia at the table, so that we can just maybe stay on this topic a little bit longer. Would you feel like, Chiara, Laura, or...
I just wanted to say something, not linked with Russia and invasion, but I really think, and I repeat myself, that based on my experience, I started to work in the G20 in Argentina. Then it came from Japan, and we talked about climate change, the next on women and climate. Nobody did it before. It was something new that we brought. Then it was Saudi. And Saudi, unexpectedly, was extremely successful in giving empowered women in business, including people to go to work. I mean, a lot of educated women didn't go to work, especially in the Middle East, and it was really enhancing that. And again, just putting the problem on the table, it's a good way to reflect what could be the solutions. And same last year, I just want to say some very good results. In the final declaration, not the one on gender, but the final declaration of President Draghi, there was something like that, in the text that makes 3 pages, on the importance of gender mainstream for peace, security, economy, for inclusive finance. I mean, not topics about women, but topics that concern the humanity as an entire. And myself, in the G20, I work a lot on 2 main issues that I would like to share with you, if you allow me, Giorgio, because I think it's important to know what could be the role of the G20. The first is the STEM education for women. If you want to be there to change the world, this disrupted world, 80% of the jobs, we don't know what it will be. And we know that we have to invent them in the next 3, 4, 5 years. We cannot let these wonderful men around the table to do it alone. We can bring a contribution. We can bring a differentiation. We can bring richness in the way of conceiving, imagining these new jobs. But if we don't have the competence, the same skills than men, and it's the case now, STEM education, it's fundamental, especially for Indonesia, for India, for South Africa, for Brazil, but also for developed countries. Worldwide, we have 20% of women engineers. When you want to build a bridge, you don't look if it's a man or a woman. You want the best talented engineers. And if you have just 20%. And worse, something that for me it's very important. Do you know that behind the algorithm there's only 22% of women coding? That means that we risk, with the best intention of the world, to create something just dangerous. Because the data that we put in, the mindset, they all correspond to just some white male coder coming from the same universities, thinking the same way. Then of course they will forget a part of. And I've just finished on that. STEM education would give access to energy, transformation of the climate change. What want girls do fight against climate. But if they don't know anything about climate, if they don't have the tools, they cannot. And the second important thing is access to capital. If we don't have the same access to capital, women and men, it's an economic disaster for all, because we create injustice, we create these financial gaps that leads to instability and war. Then those two topics, at my sense, should really be at the core of the work of the G20. It's what we are doing, with some success, by the way.
Thank you, Chiara. So maybe we're kind of identifying some topics on which it is very hard to find consensus. Of course, the geopolitical tensions and the war, and others on which there is maybe some more margin for optimism, like gender equality, education, and maybe also finance. So I would like to ask you, Sachin, about how the G20 can address the big problem that we are experiencing with this crisis and with the previous one, with the pandemic, which is economic fragmentation we are assisting to. We see that trade relations have deteriorated in some cases. We see the potential emergence of a transatlantic trade tension as it used to be in the past. You studied those topics, so how do you think that the G20 could address these problems?
Thanks, Giorgio. I think 2 or 3 issues here are extremely important. And one that I feel probably emerging markets bring on table is this whole narrative dominance that we see from our financial institutions. The excessive financialization that we have seen in the past with the dominance of the Chicago School is in terms of how we look at the question of wider participation of all the countries. So while 2015 we adopted the Sustainable Development Goals, leaving no one behind, but we immediately forgot the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, which we also adopted. And we were on climate change in Paris. So here, the issue is that we need to bring back all the actors, their development experiences, and see how we take it forward. And this is something that Laura very rightly mentioned. Experiences of India, China, Brazil, they are important to be mainstream. And the dominance of one particular school across IFIs and across the Western thought processes would have to be changed. And that metamorphosis is something what President Macron yesterday mentioned in his concluding remarks in Paris Peace Forum, in terms of how do we open it up. And that's where the new narrative has to come in. And that part, I would say, has to have a balance in terms of indigeneity of development experiences. Like, for instance, if I quickly give you one example of inflation targeting that we are seeing in the US, the quantitative easing and capital outflow from most of the developing countries, the collapse of the exchange rate, and growing cost of accessing capital, be that by men or women or by the countries as a whole. So I think this huge loss that we are seeing is something which is mind-boggling. I was at COP27 just 2 days back, and we found the whole fragmentation that we are seeing in the development process, both in terms of environmental-related approaches, the climate change-related approaches, and development, they are fragmented. So as a result, the finance which is available for climate change, finance that is available as green finance, finance which is SDG-aligned finance, SDG-aligned resource mobilization, or even simple development cooperation flows. Alia today did this fantastic panel for Lebanon, and we heard about this huge fragmentation that is happening. So economy would have to be consolidated. Indonesian presidency has done this remarkable job of bringing forward the blended finance and bringing in private sector. But I think we need to go far beyond, because private sector has no money to place on the table. How do you create mechanisms to have the ownership? After all, we all created World Bank when we were completely bankrupt. The global economy had no money. But then we created the institutions, and I think that's where the institutional focus has to come back.
Thank you very much. I would maybe, it can be interesting if it turns also out to be an economics debate. So you were mentioning how the liberal paradigm, this Chicago School way of thinking is dominating a bit the way in which this global forum are organized and the academic discussion around it. So we have the chance of having a second economist here, and I would like to ask you, Laura, whether you think that the G20 can deliver on the challenges that has just been mentioned, and how can the G20 can be held accountable for this kind of targets?
No, I think Sachin touches in very important issues. I think we talk about fragmentation of the world economy, but there is a crisis of globalization as well. And the old model of institutions and trade is not delivering, and is not delivering to the people in the global north, and even less so in the global south. So there is need for change. There is need to rethink what is global trade. There is need to rethink, of course, development finance, and in particular climate finance. I think the G20 has made some interesting contributions to that in the past. So we saw, for instance, the G20 commissioning a report on why the World Bank and the multilateral development banks are not taking enough risk or are not using their balance sheets in the best possible way to actually provide the resources that the climate transition and development needs, and try to push for that. I think it can go beyond actually in pushing for implementation of this new capital adequacy framework. I think the G20 also had a role to play in the G20 OECD inclusive framework on taxation. There are still questions, by the way, whether this will be implemented. I think it's much less ambitious and much less favorable to the global south than it should be, but at least it was a paradigm shift in terms of trying to understand taxation and global minimum taxes as something that is relevant to end and put a stop to the race to the bottom that we have been seeing in the world economy. So these are steps that have been taken, but I think we need to go a lot further, and the G20 is the space to coordinate among leaders to push the institutions and the international financial institutions in that direction. If we don't deliver, we can believe that the economic model potentially would work, but then the risk there is that we have a crisis in democracy, and that crisis in democracy is, I think, very dangerous, and we have alternatives to globalization that have appeared that are basically just protectionism and liberalism, and I think we need to provide a different alternative that deliver to people but understand the role of multilateral institutions in delivering to challenges that are global. If each country is doing their own solution, of course, the result will be more inequality at the domestic level and at the global levels.
Thank you. I mean, you put a lot of economic files on the table, so the challenges are very big. There is this struggle to find a new economic model which is between this tendency towards protectionism and the liberal model that we had before. But then the very question of our panel is how, in a very practical way, the G20 can deliver on these issues. And for example, we had last year a very strong commitment on the transfer of IMF special drawing rights from richer countries to developing countries. And of course, it was great news. It was celebrated by everyone. But then if we go into the details, we see that those DTS, a big part of them has not been transferred yet. So again, we saw a very big political commitment that didn't turn into a policy result. And what you mentioned, lower taxation, is it's another very interesting example. It gained momentum with the G20. We had a very strong role of France, who was pushing for getting a deal done on that. But now the big challenge is to move it to national legislation and to EU legislation. So big problems to transpose the EU directive on corporate taxation, and even bigger problem to transpose the text on and to define the text and then transpose it on global taxation. So if we take those examples that you mentioned, they kind of show us how difficult it is for the G20 to deliver on that. And I think that maybe here is where the role of a G20 presidency become very important. So I wanted to ask you, Dino, since you know diplomacy very well, and of course Indonesia, how do you feel that Indonesia did in all these negotiations at the ministerial level and now at the summit level? Like how important it is for Indonesia to chair the G20 and what vision it can bring to those countries?
Yeah, despite the possible absence of communique at the high level, there can be movements in the areas that are being discussed. For example, there will be a launch of the financial intermediary fund in terms of health global infrastructure. So there will be about a fund of $1.5 billion. The money comes from the developed as well as developing countries of the G20. And it is supposed to be a fund that can help if there would be another pandemic coming around, right? So, I mean, it shows that, yes, things can proceed, right? And I think the benefit of the G20 is that it allows the G20 economies to talk and possibly find a common strategic direction, right? I mean, yes, it may be reflected in the communique, but even without it, during the discussion that I attended, it's just like any other G20 meetings in the past, right? Except maybe now it's 80% on these technical issues and then 20% on always somebody interjects on the Russia-Ukraine war, right? But the technical discussions are there. I took part in the tourism working group, for example, and they agreed on something called the Bali Action Plan, which is more sustainable tourism, quality jobs, and so on. It's just that it's not furnished with a communique, right? So what you will see in the possible absence of communique is a chair statement. So the presidency of Indonesia will say, okay, we couldn't agree on a communique, but here is my summary of what happened. And that's when the president will outline what are the things that were discussed and where he felt there was some movement in the right strategic direction among the G20 countries. But I think we talk about cooperation, it will be a la carte, right? It will be a la carte because, again, cooperation with Russia for the West is just not possible, right? Cooperation with China, possible, but with terms, certain terms, restricted and very cautious, right? And cooperation with emerging economies, I think is wide open. So you're talking about a la carte cooperation that is probably we're going to see at the G20. Yeah.
I mean, that's very interesting. So we could maybe think at the G20 in this time of geopolitical tensions, not so much, correct me if I am understanding wrongly, but not so much as a forum that brings political commitments, strong political commitments, but maybe at a good opportunity to have a picture of what the different positions are. And this statement by the chair that you were mentioning, they will maybe help us to very well understand where the different countries stand and see what are the tensions between them. And maybe just to go back to what you were saying, for example, the tourism initiative, like we have many initiatives like that in the G20, but then there is an issue of implementation. So maybe that's a question I would like to ask to both of you, Sachin and Chiara, whether you think that the G20 could benefit from a system that year after year can allow you to have a check on how policies are implemented. I mean, as an economist, of course, you have a science-based approach. So if things are not demonstrated, if there are not deep reported case studies, you cannot establish effects. But while the G20 maybe doesn't always work like that. So maybe we could ask for you, Sachin, and then to Chiara with the same question. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Giorgio. I think at the outset, we would have to realize this huge gap that we have, and I was talking about the fragmentation of finance. So we need consolidation, certainly, and I think it is largely in terms of the way we are looking at finance gap in energy transition, the huge climate change impact that we have, and also in terms of how this resource is mobilized and included. Given the challenge that Earth has, and I think the challenge that we have of fragmentation and exclusion, what Indian presidency of G20 is likely to bring forward is this idea of bringing everyone along and trying to focus on one Earth, one family, and one future. So if we have this idea of one Earth, one family, one future forward, how that shared future would look like, and in what way all stakeholders would have their say. So from a perspective of infrastructure financing for energy transition, the transitional finance that is needed, Because what you need is, at this point, how do you make transition? In fact, for several countries, this transition is actually transformation. They have to change their systems. They have to change several dimensions to have that achievement of solar energy or whatever renewable energy you are looking forward for. So this transition and transformation require funding. It requires huge funding. The PGII has come up with something like $650 billion by 2027. We are looking at $2.5 to $3 trillion every year for countries to have. Where would this money come from? And who would bring that in? How that would be generated? India has demonstrated by accomplishing this through local resource mobilization. We have invested $26 billion in last 2 years on our infrastructure building, which is largely the local resource mobilization. And this is where I think women-led enterprises, women empowerment, their participation, and participation of all sections of society. So we to make efforts to make economic development more inclusive, more participative, and bringing in this point that I mentioned earlier in terms of the endogeneity of the element. We have to have our own strategies, and that's how we can do that. The IMF kept on telling India to focus on inflation targeting and not so much on employment. We did not bother. I am on the board of the Central Bank of India, on the Reserve Bank of India, and we did not bother at all. And now you look at the whole world is grappling with inflation, and India is not so much bothered about inflation. And we could ensure our employment, we could see the productive investment going in. So this is the strength of we taking our own call, of course in a concerted manner, but this I think is absolutely important.
Totally. And then there is the issue of measuring how whether we meet those goals that we decide or not. And maybe Chiara, I would like also to ask you about this. How do you have any ideas of how we could do
Yes,
that?
I just wanted to also highlight something that for me it's very important when you talk about to measure and the progress. We're talking about the responsibility of capital state, but don't forget that in the G20, the private sectors is very involved. And I can speak about my experience with the private sector. We really did progresses, because even if there are not laws, even if it's not exactly, there are some mindset that change. There are some best practices that go to be natural. I mean, when somebody does give an example in a company and makes better profits, then the other will follow. But if they don't know it, because Brazil did not talk what they are, the best company are doing, this fact that we can gather fact and figures, best practices in the G20, for me is precious. How we can capitalize 1 year after. In my field, in gender equality, I think we won't go back. I really think we did a lot of progress since we started to very small, thinking what could be done. Now I think it's, as you say, it's part of the inclusive mainstream of the I give you an example. Last year, there was, that's very symbolic, there was for the first time a gender equality meeting of ministers. This year in Indonesia, they did the same. We met at the end of August, and I'm sure that India will do the same, and even maybe more. I mean, you cannot go back. But what I would really, propose a very strong way, and I did it in many times, we need data. For instance, in gender equality, we don't have disaggregated data. We cannot compare, we cannot measure the progress, we don't have data. And OCDE is working on that. We work a lot with OCDE. Yesterday evening, I was talking with Matthias Korman saying we need data. Data in the G20 countries, but many countries don't have the same data or not the same statistics. And you cannot work with that. Then this is the first thing. The second thing, a lot of declaration, great. We decide to do this law, etc. And who decides, who controls it as implemented or not? The only thing that could be is the pressure of the civil society saying, we had promised you this. As in an election, we promised you this. Now we have to deliver. And this, I really think that the media, the communication should be much more strong to put in the advancement at the G20 results, not just saying, oh, it's just a communique, we don't care, because that will make advance the mentalities in the economy and society.
By the way, just one interesting observation. So I told you earlier, the working groups at the government level all stuck no communique. But at the civil society level, they do produce a communique. Because you got B20, and religion.
And we did a very good one.
Yeah. And religion 20, they came up with a statement. I took part also in the Urban 20 because no minister, so it's not political, right? They don't have to ask Moscow, can we do this, right? So there is a difference. At the civil society level, at the engaged group, they were quite productive. But when it came to the working group at ministerial level, it's all stuck. And one point that is, I think, should be said also, you know, what is politically interesting and significant about Indonesia's G20 is that we got 4 global South countries taking the presidency: Indonesia, India, Brazil, and South Africa, right? So that's never happened before. And I think the message that we want to, the strategic message that we want to convey is this. Look, the world is divided, Russia and the West, right? The West and China and so on. And it's going to happen for a long time. Even though there's going to be peace in Ukraine tomorrow, the relations between Russia and the West is permanently broken, right? So what the global South countries want to say is, okay, that will go on for a while, but hey, don't forget we got SDGs, right? That was in the front burner for a while, and we don't want that to be put aside. We got this climate challenge, green transition, net zero targets, that cannot be pushed aside, right? We got inequity, you know, pandemic, health, global infrastructure, and all these things. Can't let the geopolitical rivalries push that aside. So I think that's the significance of the global South 4 countries taking the next presidency for the next 4 years. Yeah.
Totally, thank you. We're nearly closing our panel. We have a question for you as well, Laura. But right before, I would like to maybe ask whether the audience would have some question. I think can be interesting to participate. Yeah, there's a question on there, please. Sorry.
Good afternoon, and thank you to the panelists for presenting their insightful arguments. My name is Ivan Krompis, a recent graduate from UCL. I am also Indonesian. I'd like to ask, how would the panelists assess Indonesia's leadership and global leadership, really, when Indonesia is leading the G20? Because when Indonesia started its presidency, no one would expect that there is a geopolitical crisis, a war between Russia and Ukraine with an unexpected fallout from the sanctions imposed on Russia. And one question specific about Indonesia to Mr. Dino Patijala. Can I ask you in Indonesian or in English or in French? Thank you, thank you. What will the G20 impact Indonesia's foreign policy outlook? Apologies. How will the G20 presidency impact Indonesia's foreign policy outlook? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So maybe, Laura, if it's okay for you, you could maybe answer to the first question, then Dino to the second one. Would you feel like it?
Sure. I think it wasn't an obvious task for Indonesia to host the presidency at the moment of a geopolitical challenge and the invasion of Ukraine. I think they actually were quite interestingly bold in terms of there was talk of even inviting President Zelensky to the G20, and Putin said he's not going, also because Indonesia was pretty forward in making sure to blame Russia for even some of these economic crises that the South is facing, right? There is a clear problem that the global South is paying the price for this war that Russia has started. So I think it was quite interesting that it was a developing country hosting that presidency at that point in time, and making sure also to put a global South view of this crisis into the table there. But of course, in terms of what the G20 can achieve during this presidency, that's obviously something that is not Indonesia's fault. It's about how we cannot get the 20 countries to back a communique, and that's, I think, the challenge. And hopefully in Bali we can at least move forward some of the agendas that we have just mentioned here.
Thank you. And Dino, maybe on the second question specific
Yeah,
on
well,
Indonesia.
you know what I tell my government? I tell my government that, I'm not government official, by the way. I tell them that, look, this G20 is not about us. It's not about us looking good. It's not about getting investments for Indonesia, getting more trade, getting more tourism. It's not about us. This is about whether or not G20 can resolve multiple mega crises faced by the world, especially because there are doubts if multilateralism by the UN can resolve them. And the G20 is the best hope because that's where the G7 is, and that's where the emerging economies are, right, and so on. And let's see if these 20 biggest economies can work together. So that's what it's all about, because 2023 is going to be dangerous year. Not just divided, but dangerous. Europe is going to be in recession, as Catalina has said. America is going to be in recession. China growth is very low, right? If you have China, Europe, and America, two of them in recession, and China is growing very, very low, who's going to pull the world economy up, right? And on top of that, Ukraine war, food and energy and finance crisis. I mean, 2023 is going to be really a bad year. And for Indonesia, the big question is, can we move and manage G20 so that can be some constructive answers to these, to alleviate the weight of these multiple mega crises?
Thank you, Dino. We have less than 1 minute left, but maybe there was a question here on the front. If you can do it very quickly,
Hello, hi, I'm Rishwa. I'm a master's student of governance and diplomacy at Sciences Po. A very quick question, and it might be a little hard one, but we know with the inflation rising, and we say inflation, I mean US dollar, and when I say US dollar, it means the world. So there is an inflation which is right in the front, and with the economies already recovering from the COVID pandemic, we can see a very, a downward trend all over the world. In that situation, and then we can see the rise of bilateralism more than multilateralism. We have seen the failure of so many, BRICS has no relevance today. UN so many times doesn't play. So in that situation, a multilateral forum like G20, and you also pointed out that problem of implementation is there. How do you think the global South, which is taking the presidency over the years, Indonesia, India, Brazil, and then South Africa, how are they going to change that narrative to prevent a recession, probably?
Thank you very much. Our time is over. Maybe Sachin, if you would feel like giving a very short answer to this question, would you feel like answering to this? Or Laura, maybe one of you?
Sure.
And then we will continue.
Yes, I think this is the global inflation that we're facing is one of these global challenges now that clearly cannot be resolved through uncoordinated central bank conventional monetary policy. So what we're seeing is inflation as driven by the war in Ukraine with consequences in every part of the world, and then the central bank, the Fed, and the ECB raising rates with dramatic consequences, not only in the north, but mostly in terms of currency devaluations and even more inflation in the south as a consequence of that. And the fact that we're tackling a global external issue through conventional tools that were not fit for this is a clear problem of how we're shaping our institutions and how not fit for purpose the multilateral system is at the moment. There are proposals out there that, of course, start from the end of the war, right? And things that are in the geopolitical sphere. But even in the economic sphere, there are proposals to give a more coordinated answer to this that does not inflict so much pain in terms of not only inflation, but hunger in many countries in the South.
Thank you very much, Laura. I'm really sorry we ran out of time, but our speakers are here. You can try to catch them while they're going away and ask them questions. Thank you.